Oh yeah, what is going on, Colts Nation? New intro video, by the way. Did you see that? If you did not notice that, by the way, that stinks because I spent a couple dollars on it. Go ahead, rewind, watch it again. Now, if you did notice it, what do you think? Not a big change. Not a big change at all. But a change nonetheless. But I digress. We're here to talk about training camp, right? You saw the title, you clicked on the video, or you clicked on the audio version. I always forget that one exists, but it does. All right. So, we're now a week out from Colts training camp, right? And the reality is that up until this point, and even right now as we speak, there's nothing actually meaningful going on with this team, right? A lot of the talking right now, and I'm guilty of it too, maybe not as much as some others. It's no disrespect. I don't mean to throw shade, but the truth is the truth. A lot of talking about talking right now, right? Like a lot of talking about nothing. I should probably have a little bit of a better plan going into next offseason, to be 100% honest with you. But that's neither here nor there. Realistically, my point in saying all of this is that at this juncture where we're at, there's no purpose in like making predictions for the season or talking about the Colts schedule, right? Or even maybe you could talk about who's going to win the position battles coming up. But at the same time, that's what training camp is for, right? Let's enjoy that process. Those things will hash themselves out and we could talk about it in real time while it's happening. But that is not here until next week. And the problem with that is it's not next week. It's this week, right? So in the meantime, I figure what we can do is go over our position groups and where they stand heading into training camp. After all, I will be going to Colts training camp for those of you who don't know, and I will be telling you what I see. So establishing the picture for each of these units and how they fit together, the perceived strengths of the groups, the perceived weaknesses of the groups, which, by the way, at this point, that's all it is, right? Perceived. It's perception, right? I don't know anything about what's coming up with the Indianapolis Colts, and you don't technically know anything either. Well, actually, hold on, that's a lie. I do know everything, right? I've never been wrong about the Indianapolis Colts in my entire life. That's why you come here and listen to me. But that doesn't mean there might not be some history made in this training camp and in this season. But at the end of the day, it's all jokes, by the way, guys. I may be a little arrogant, but I'm not that arrogant, okay? It's all an educated guess what we're doing here, right? That's kind of the whole point of the gimmick here. Last time we spoke, I did a little bit of talking about the defensive line and that's where we spent our first round pick. And while at some point before next Thursday, I'm going to try to revisit that position again through kind of this same lens of viewing it as like a training camp preview and looking at the position group as a whole, I figure we might as well start this one off today with perhaps the most popular position battle we have going into camp, the position we picked in the second round, wide receiver, right? The goal is that by the end of today's episode, you'll have a real good understanding of what this wide receiver room consists of going into training camp, what we're looking at, the position battles, the players you need to know, the players you don't need to know, all that stuff. Sound good? All right. Without further ado, then, you know what it is. I got to introduce myself. Someone said, hey, Justin, stop introducing yourself so far into the show. Never. I will never stop introducing myself, all right? You know who I am. But there's other people here for the first time, and they don't know, right? And that's what we're here to do. So my name is Justin. This right here is the Ride on the Bench Colts podcast. As always, ask anyone on YouTube and enjoying the video, go ahead, shoot it a like. It's going to help me get out to as many Colts fans as humanly possible. Audio listeners, 5-star review. Let the people know how much you like the show. If you don't like the show, hell, get the heck out of here. Do something else with your time, right? Make your own damn show. Of course, we're trying to get to 3,000 subscribers by the season. We're running out of time. Perhaps that's not in the cards, but nonetheless, we want to continue to grow. If you keep coming back, enjoying the content, go ahead, subscribe, be along for the journey. Again, I am going from New York, JFK Airport, 800 miles to Indianapolis next week to watch the Colts practice for 2 days, just to let you guys know, because I know that so many people that listen to this channel, which I appreciate, are Colts fans, not from Indiana, not from Indianapolis. We did a poll a while back. It's nearly a 50-50 split, which I think is pretty cool. I'd like to believe to some degree I represent the audience of Colts fans that were kind of picked up during the Peyton Manning era that became when we became like a nationwide team, right? There's a quick moment where the Colts could have been America's team. Now, it didn't quite get to that point, but the fan base expanded very much because of those wonderful years. I'd like to believe I represent a little bit of that population. Of course, video time-stamped as always. So if you want to hear about a certain position battle, right, Adonai Mitchell and Alec Pierce, that'll be time-stamped. Any player you want to hear about is going to be time-stamped. You can skip to exactly where it is that you want to be. But, of course, I encourage you to listen to the entire episode. That housekeeping was way too long. All right, let's get into it. Let's get into the Colts shit, okay? So, as far as what we should feel certain about going into training camp with this wide receiver room, there's really two guys whose roles we assume are locked in this offense. So I want to start there because that's a bit less interesting in terms of, I don't know, speculation and discussion and things like that. Figure get those ones out of the way for the casual Colts fans, and then the real Colts fans will stick around for the deep cuts on the back end of the episode, right? So the first obvious one, of course, is Michael Pittman Jr., and then maybe the less obvious one, who I feel has a clear and obvious secure role in this offense, is Josh Downs. Let's start with Michael Pittman Jr. Excuse me. A little water. All right. Let's start with Michael Pittman Jr. because we already know what Michael Pittman Jr. brings to the table. In fact, we should already appreciate it. That being said, there is no group of football fans in the entire NFL that throws more shade at Michael Pittman Jr. than Colts fans, right? Whatever you want to say about him being a wide receiver one, not being a wide receiver one, the fact that you think he's good enough, the fact that he's not good enough, he's a model citizen. He's one of the top 15 to 20 wide receivers in this league. And even if you don't think he's a bona fide wide receiver number one, you'd have to assume he at least belongs in a group of 1A, 1B, that type of situation, right? He's right there. The reality is that this Colts offense is at its best when Michael Pittman Jr. is involved, or at a minimum, when the defense needs to account for his presence on the field. You look at last season, the one game we did not have Michael Pittman Jr., we got starched by the Taylor Heineke-led Falcons with Arthur fucking Smith leading the helm, okay? Now, listen, the offense in that game looked absolutely anemic. And while I do think it's reasonable to expect the offense to be a bit more well-rounded going into this season, Michael Pittman Jr. is in line for another season as this team's leading receiver. Nothing to see here. Now, Josh Downs, on the other hand, I think might require a little bit more of an explanation. Now, I know we all like Josh Downs a lot as Colts fans. Like, I think the consensus is that we're really, really high on him. So I don't think it's so much a matter of me having to convince you on his talent and what he brings to the table, as much as it is a matter of making the case that his role and involvement in this offense is one that we can feel confident in really on a week-to-week basis. And I think in training camp, it's going to show this guy is kind of one of the pieces that makes this offense move. And I'm expecting a big year out of him. But again, it's not a matter of the predictions for the season. It's about painting the picture of what this room looks like going into camp. So let's start right here. Speak of training camp. For those of you who were around last year, you may actually remember that was my first time going to training camp, my first time going to any training camp, let alone Colts training camp. One of my major takeaways from that experience was that Josh Downs was going to be involved in this offense early and often. I also knew that Anthony Richardson was a pocket passer. I knew he was significantly better than people thought he was, which is why I encourage anyone that could get out to training camp to go ahead and do it, because as it turns out, you learn a lot about the team before most people know about it, which is a very, very cool thing. But when you show up, my point, right? Let's go back to Josh Downs. When you show up and they're designing plays for the third-round rookie out of the slot, when you have a veteran slot receiver at that time, of course, in Isaiah McKenzie on the roster, who could have been at least splitting that time with Josh Downs, right? You know you're in to see something. And now you look at the room, which we will discuss, of course, as the episode continues on, and there's really only one other guy that really projects as a true slot receiver on this team. Now, of course, anyone can get plugged into the slot if they had to, but in terms of being a specialist, Josh Downs is now the guy, unquestionably, on this roster, and basically, I think, projects to be second on the team in targets to Michael Pittman Jr., and if not second on the team in targets, certainly when you talk about how this offense is doing their game plan from in terms of the passing game, Josh Downs is going to be a focal point, even if at times it's for a distraction. I think there was a lot of times last year where you saw in the second half of the season, teams really started honing in on him and his presence because him and Garner had such great chemistry. Josh Downs is a guy I'm really excited to see what he does in training camp. And again, That's the guy out of the slot right now. He's going to be on the field a lot, and that's, of course, in training camp as well. Now, here's the one right here, A.D. Mitchell versus Alec Pierce. This is the one that everyone has been talking about, and quite frankly, for good reason, right? And you do get the feeling that going into this season, if one of these guys can come in and really produce for this offense on a consistent week-to-week basis, that this team can really be a juggernaut on that side of the ball, right? So that's what's at stake with this position battle, is the difference between the Colts being a very good offense and one of the elite offenses in football, in my estimation, is making sure we have a guy on the outside, opposite of Michael Pittman Jr., that is going to come out every single week and bring it on a consistent basis. And much like Kwity Paye being a former first-round pick and seeing the team bring in Laitu Latu, Alec Pierce is going through much of the same thing with A.D. Mitchell, right? A former second-rounder himself, now seeing them draft A.D. Mitchell in that second round to be who they wanted him to be, him being Alec Pierce, right? You know damn well that whether Alec Pierce says it or not, and any of you guys who have played a team sport before are going to relate to this on some level, Alec Pierce is feeling some type of way, for sure, about them bringing A.D. Mitchell in, particularly as you see the fan base kind of gushing over A.D. Mitchell, almost like Alec Pierce is an afterthought. Now, there's a famous saying, of course, that pressure makes diamonds. And if Pierce is what he thinks he is, what he says he wants to be, not saying that just because you want it, you are, and it's not like if he doesn't become a great football player, that's not because he didn't want it. Sometimes guys just don't have it, right? But if he is what he thinks he can be, we'd have to assume that he's going to make this a very interesting battle in this upcoming training camp, and we have to assume that it would be his best training camp showing to date on this football team. If not, then obviously it'll all but confirm and validate every reason we drafted A.D. Mitchell. Now, anyone, of course, who watched my pre-draft content, forget the post-draft content, right? My pre-draft content knows how high I am on A.D. Mitchell. I'm not sure I have ever in my life been more excited about a draft pick basically since Andrew Luck on this team. Like, Mitchell was my guy at the wide receiver position in this draft. And of course, everyone knew that at some point we were going to be targeting that position. It's just very, very rare that you develop a favorite player during the draft and then he ends up getting drafted to your team. Again, last year, it was clear from training camp that Josh Downs was going to be a factor early as a rookie. I'm curious to see if I can pick up on any of the same thing in the way that they use Adonai Mitchell, or Adonai Mitchell, let me correct myself. Curious to see how often he's going to be playing with the ones going into training camp. When I say the ones, I mean the starting unit. And if they're going to be drawing things up for him, is he just kind of a placeholder piece that could just be plug and play? Or are they going to be designing plays for him? It's one of the main things I'm going to be watching for next week. I fully expect A.D. Mitchell to show out. I expect him to be a story. And kind of for those of you who are fantasy people, start looking around for the name A.D. Mitchell from all your little fantasy sleeper guys, right? All those nerds who didn't start watching football till the age of 20 and all of a sudden think they could tell us how to freaking draft our guys, but that's a story for a different day, right? I expect A.D. Mitchell to be a pretty big factor as a rookie, but it all starts in training camp, right? Now, with that said, let's be fair. Even the great Jamar Chase had issues catching the football early on as a rookie in training camp, preseason, and I believe early in that rookie season. So this part of his career isn't everything in terms of how we see him panning out long term, but seeing the usage, even if he doesn't produce at a high level, seeing the effort to use him will at least speak to where the coaching staff is on him, kind of where he can contribute, how he can contribute to this offense early on, and what they think he can bring. Spoiler alert, I think he brings a lot to this team. You're talking sure hands. You're talking a deceptively fast football player. You're talking about a guy who is 6'4" and has body control that is just, you just can't teach. The way he can contort his body and kind of some of the acrobatic catches he could make. I think he's going to end up being, and I hate to just slight Alec Pierce in this process, I think he's going to be everything we wanted Pierce to be. But listen, if Pierce comes out and beats A.D. Mitchell, I'm going to tell you it's not because A.D. Mitchell ain't good enough. It's because Pierce is better than perhaps we think he is. So I just want to point that out as we move forward kind of into training camp. Now, for some of the deeper cuts, let's talk about the wide receiver 5 position and the wide receiver 6. And I say 5 and 6, even though we have like 12 bodies going into training camp, because I just can't imagine us rostering any more than 6 receivers. Now, I suppose to some degree there's a level of unknown with that because of those new kickoff rules, right? It might change the type of bodies that teams want to keep on their roster, but I couldn't say anything for certain, right? And if that happens, it's obviously going to affect the amount of players that you're keeping at given positions. It may look a little different than other seasons, so that's something to keep in mind. But at the same time, you look at the depth that this team has on the defensive line and seemingly the depth that they've started to develop on the offensive line. It's kind of hard to imagine that there's much wiggle room at this wide receiver room in terms of it moving past 6 guys on the roster, knowing what we know about Ballard's team building philosophy, which is build from the trenches, build from the inside out, right? Now, I'm going to start with the guys that I kind of think have the inside track at winning that wide receiver 5 and 6 job before kind of talking about, I guess, some of the possible other options, right? And those guys are Anthony Gould, the rookie that I have yet to speak about, honestly, and Ashton Dulin. Now, Anthony Gould will start there. You have to assume that he ends up on this roster for a number of reasons. Number one, right off the bat, we drafted him in the 5th round, right? Now, obviously, last year we drafted Darius Rush in the 5th round, and we let him go before he ever played a regular season snap for this football team, right? But there's a reason that was a big story. There's a reason that was a surprise. That's not typical, right? That's an exception to the rule. You draft a guy in the 5th round, he usually has a place on the roster in his first year. Worst case scenario, practice squad, but kind of the way they spoke about Anthony Gould, I think they view him as perhaps someone who could have been drafted higher than the 5th round, right? And number two, I said before, I was talking about Josh Downs. There's only one guy on this team that projects to be a slot specialist in this league. Anthony Gould is the guy, right? Now, he seems to kind of be Isaiah McKenzie's natural replacement. That's just kind of how I take it, right? They view him as a returner and a pretty solid receiver. That was the role that Isaiah McKenzie played last year before he got a mysterious suspension that perhaps one day we'll hear about in 5 years when he's on some sort of podcast or something like that, and we forgot he was a member of the team, right? But listen, sure, he played everywhere in college. I'm going back to Anthony Gould, right? But at 5'8", around 170, 175 pounds, with his speed, having him learn the slot primarily in this league is essentially a no-brainer, right? Just his skill set and what he does fits very well into that position. Curious to see, right? It's one thing to be fast, all right? I know this type of stuff to some people might sound like it doesn't matter, but it does, right? It's one thing to be fast and explosive, but it's another thing to have lateral speed, right? To be able to get in and out of cuts really quick. I'm curious to see how well Anthony Gould turns his hips, pause, right? I'm curious to see how well he does with some of those quick outs and some of those like whip type routes and some of those more slot specific type of routes. I know he's fast and I know he's dynamic, but I'm curious to see in terms of the route tree how he fits into that position. But when you talk about physically speaking, he's a prototype at the slot. So curious to see what he brings to the table. And then the third reason I know he's going to make the roster is, and perhaps most importantly, is his ability as a returner, right? Now, this may just be my personal preference, but it sounds like something I might have heard from someone smarter than me. Like, you ever have like a fact that you know that you're certain that you heard from somewhere that was credible, but also you couldn't like recite where it came from. You couldn't cite your source. This is one of those facts, right? In a perfect world, your return man would not be a starter on your team, whether that be on offense or defense, right? Just because you have additional risk of injury, more mileage, all those types of things, right? Last year, we saw Josh Downs returning a lot of punts and kicks. And while I don't want to forget about how good Dallas Flowers was in that role in the Matt Ryan year, if we remember, right? He was kind of one of the best returners in the league that year. And at his age, we were kind of looking and saying, whoa, this guy may be an X factor for us moving forward. He's also coming off a torn Achilles, and we don't know exactly how he's going to look early on coming off of that injury. I mean, there's been a decent amount of time since it happened, but when you're running, right, because playing corner is just like a track meet at a certain point. When you're running that much, you don't exactly know how that thing is going to, act early on in this training camp. But for that reason and the others I stated, again, Gould seems positioned to be an important piece of this wide receiver core. Not just make the roster, I think he has a chance to kind of be like a gadget guy in this offense. Curious to see how they're using him and if there's a role for him beyond just being the backup slot. Shane Steichen, very creative, very good at getting the most out of his talent. Anthony Gould is a guy that has a whole bunch of talent, and you're just curious if there's something there in Steichen's mind where he could kind of move him around. You know what I'm saying? If you remember like a Dante Hall on the Kansas City Chiefs, he was kind of able to be used all over the place. I wonder if we get some of that same stuff right here out of an Anthony Gould. Now, Ashton Dulin would be next. And I say Ashton Dulin as the guy because I think he's the favorite to be kind of on the back end of this roster, right? Of course, there's other guys fighting for that last receiver spot as well. I'll talk about them briefly, but there's only a couple I think have a chance, right? Ballard has been very open about the fact that he really values Ashton Dulin, like to the point where he even mentioned him in his end of season press conference, talking about how big of a loss it was that Ashton Dulin went down with a torn ACL in training camp. Now, if I'm being honest, I'm not sure how much I'm buying that particular premise from Chris Ballard in terms of like, I don't think Ashton Dulin would have swung the needle too much in the winning ways for the Indianapolis Colts. Like, I don't think Ashton Dulin was the difference between this team making the playoffs and not making the playoffs, but at the same time, he's definitely been an excellent special teams contributor for this football team in his time here. He can play both inside and outside at wide receiver. That versatility makes him an ideal backup because now you know if your slot goes down, he can play there. If a guy outside goes down, he can play there. And out of a backup, that's kind of what you need because you only have so many roster spots, right? But I do think this year he is going to have to earn that spot on the back end of the wide receiver room, particularly because as much as we know Ballard likes him, ultimately, he's going to defer to Shane Steichen and what he sees. And we have guys like Juwann Winfree and DJ Montgomery as bodies coming into this training camp who I'd say can at least give him a run. In fact, I quite like what Juwann Winfree brought to us last preseason or the preseason before. I forget how long he's been kind of on this team in the practice squad type of role now. But I do tend to like what I see from Winfree, and I do wonder if there's a chance that he ends up taking this spot from Dulin with the right training camp and with the right preseason. Overall, I doubt it, but Montgomery and Winfree for sure are guys I'm going to be watching going into training camp next week. Other guys that we have in training camp, and just in case you're there and you see some people that you've never heard of in your entire life or you just don't know who they are, Tyree Cleveland, Ethan Freina, Xavier White, a rookie, and Derek Slicka, who I think was there last year, if I'm not mistaken. I don't anticipate any of these guys making a run at the roster, but perhaps one of them ends up a valuable practice squad piece. We'll have to see. I'll let you know if any of them stand out next weekend. So just so you know, schedule coming up. That's the whole episode, by the way. But tomorrow we have the tight end room that we're going to be covering in either Sunday or Monday, possibly Sunday, more likely Monday. I'm so bad with timelines, by the way. The amount of times I've told you guys that I'm going to do something one day and it doesn't end up happening at all, I should probably stop doing this, but I'm doing it anyway. Call it Sunday or Monday. We're going to be going over the secondary, and then I'll try to do another episode on some burning questions and last-second thoughts and players to watch headed into training camp before I ultimately get on my flight from JFK to Indianapolis next Friday to give you guys the inside scoop. But until tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Eastern, all right? I'm giving you time and everything. You know, okay, that episode will be there. Until then, my name is Justin. This right here was the Ride to the Bench Colts podcast. And as always, go Colts.